Hi everyone, my name is Karen Fabian and I'm the founder of Bare Bones Yoga. Thanks for taking a minute to come here to my YouTube channel and watch this video. So I wanted to talk to you today about some of the anatomy behind back bends and some of the cues that you might hear, and you might wonder kind of what's behind them. So one of the postures I want to take a look at is dancer's pose. And dancer's pose, you might not think of it as a back bend, you might think of it as a balancing posture, which it is, but because we're moving through the thoracic spine, taking that up and back, we're creating that greater curve in the spine itself, or a lordotic curve, but it's not kind of something that's bad, it's just part of the posture, right? So anytime that we are doing back bends, we are looking for flexibility from certain muscles. And if you just kind of look, even as I just stand here and take my arms up and I go up and back, I need to have good flexibility in this frontal line here in order to get moving in that backwards direction. And so what I'm really looking for is flexibility from muscles that flex my hip. So one of the key things, and this is most likely part of the reason, I don't know if teachers have really thought of it, but one of the reasons why we do all this preparatory stuff in class before we teach back bends, because we want to get some mobility at the frontal hip joint. And so if you think about muscles like that cross the hip and create flexion, we're looking at the psoas, the rectus femoris, the iliopsoas. That's kind of a combination of iliacus and psoas. And so we want to have sartorius, we want to have good flexibility there. And so some warm-up is required, some mobility is required. And then additionally, not only do we want to have flexibility here, we want to have strength in the muscles that extend the spine. So spinal extension is this way. Spinal flexion is this way. So if I'm moving this way, someone's got to be helping me do that, some muscle. And so when you look at the back of the spine, you start to get into muscles like the erector spinae muscles, which run parallel to the spine, up and down both sides. And their contraction is what creates that spinal extension. Now, one of the things to keep in mind is that you probably know this from your own posture. We're here a lot in that kind of passive flexion, but we're definitely not here a lot. It's not as if during the day we're doing things to reach in this direction. So those muscles, spinal extensor muscles, erector spinae, can be somewhat deconditioned. And so moving in this plane can be challenging. Additionally, those hip flexors, because we're sitting a lot, again, posture, those muscles can be somewhat deconditioned as well and may even be a little bit too tight. So we've got resistance pulling us in this direction. We've got some kind of weakness or deconditioning, resisting that movement backwards. So the combination of those two things can create a lot of different things that we'll see people do in the poses. Now, the other thing that I neglected to mention is the gluteus maximus is also a muscle, of course, responsible for back bending. That muscle is not so much relative to the back and the spine's position, but relative to the hips position, as are the hamstrings, because the hamstrings start on the ischial tuberosity and the end of the knee. So if it starts on the ischial tuberosity, which is your sitting bone, that's part of your pelvis, it's going to affect what your hip is doing, because your pelvis is part of your hip. So we're looking not only for the extensors to get us that way, but we're looking for that posterior power chain of glute max to hamstrings to help us extend the hip. So keeping all that in mind, when you ask somebody to come into a standing balance like dancer's pose, not only might you see kind of limited movement in this plane, but you might see the knee turn out. And so when you're looking at that person, you might think, why is their knee turning out? Well, what I like to do oftentimes is look at the muscle that's the prime actor and see if there's another function that muscle does. And as it turns out, the gluteus maximus is not only a hip extender, it's also an external rotator. And so oftentimes, if the person's unaware of that other thing the muscle does, they'll come into the pose and they'll hear what you're saying and they'll try to do what you ask them to do, but that other thing will start to happen. And you see that not only in dancer's pose, but also in wheel. I'm not actually going to do an entire wheel pose, but I'm going to give you the mechanics of it. I'm not going to do it simply because I'm not warmed up. So what I like to do sometimes is have people put a block between their feet when they're on the ground. And when they move up and back, having their feet anchored into the block can prevent that turnout. And the next time you do your home practice, because I know right now with the corona outbreak, everybody's practicing at home, feel what's happening at the ground in terms of the position of your feet. Because if they start to turn out, that could be something that prior to this conversation was kind of unconscious to you. And that turnout is oftentimes the result of Gluteus Maximus, other thing that's happening. The other thing that could potentially be a factor is you could have some overactive external rotators. And so whenever we have something happen that's an undesired action, it could be this piece I'm talking about here, a prime mover and its other function. But it also could be that something that does that thing is overactive. And so here, if you think about external rotators that are back here, like the piriformis and gemelli muscles, for instance, if they're overactive, they might turn your feet out too. So how does this translate into bow? So floor bow. So if I were to come down onto the ground and grab both of my feet, again, I'm not going to do it just because I'm not warm, but imagine me on my belly here, I might also see the same turnout that I saw in dancers. And so the knee turn out as I lay on the ground and grab both of my feet is indicative of potentially Gluteus Maximus, alternate function of external rotation of the hips, or maybe external rotators being overactive. So what's your role as a yoga teacher there? It's really just to cue people more to neutral or more towards the desired action, but not to force it, especially with something like a block between the feet. You don't want to, you want to encourage people, but not, say, oh my God, you guys really got to keep your feet plastered into that block. Because we don't always know the reason for the compensation. And so we don't want to force people to do something that is really way out of the way of how their body is working right now, even if that way is not super desired. This comes up a lot more in the exercise science world because I have a background in personal training and corrective exercise. I know a lot of what happens in that world, which is a little different than what happens in yoga. One of the primary differences is in the exercise science world, you're really calming muscles down and using myofascial release before you do active and dynamic movement. And here in yoga, we don't really do that. We don't use that tool. So if we do have some overactivity, in this case, in the external rotators, we're not really doing too much to kind of bring that muscular tone down a bit before we go and do all these movements. And that can sometimes stay with the person, and as they do the poses, those compensations will show up. So your role again is just to coach them into the posture, and after maybe one corrective cue attempt, just move on to the next thing, and we're not looking for perfect poses. So I want to tell you one more thing before I wrap up. Here it is on Friday, May 15th, and I'm currently in the middle of a couple of days, today and tomorrow is what's left on it, of making an offer to yoga teachers who are interested in learning anatomy. So if you like this video and you feel like this is definitely something you want to learn more about, just send me an email. It's Karen@barebonesyoga.com, and I'll send you information about how you can enroll in my special signature program, which is called the Blueprint Learning Program. And there's no obligation to take a look at the offer. You can just take a look at it. If you have any questions, let me know. Otherwise, for the next 2 days, enrollment is open for you to take advantage of. All right, so I hope you have a good rest of your day. Thanks for watching. Namaste.